Brighton started off life as a spectacularly unspectacular fishing village and was more than content with its lot to remain quiet and to smell strongly of fish. That was until the 1750s when a local doctor called Richard Russell started making a huge fuss about how much fun bathing in the sea was. What's more, Russell suggested it was a medical kind of fun, which was a fact that caught the immediate attention of King George's eldest son, George, who at 21 was suffering from some unimaginably disgusting side effects brought on by the kind of binge living that would make him infamous. Everyone else got themselves a cosy hotel room with a nice sea view and a hospitality tray, but George wanted his own place. Now, believe it or not, this started life as a rather ordinary farmhouse then. I really don't want you to think that this place is somehow a sign of its times. All of this was maniacal madness.
Setting the tone is Ellis Pike, who's come as George IV.
You cannot separate George from Brighton. Wherever you go, he's sort of hanging over Brighton. No matter how modern it gets, no matter how contemporary it gets, there's still him in the background.
I really find that, yes. In his own day, he used to come down here because he believed it was the only place that he was really loved. And still, people down here in Brighton, they love him. And he is a personification almost of that sort of exuberance that Brighton has. They were, all of them, larger-than-life people and led this larger-than-life existence and very much in the public spotlight. And this at a time when the whole of England had just come out of the Napoleonic Wars and the country had become virtually bankrupt through it. And then all of a sudden, at the end of that, there's an explosion of people behaving the most extraordinarily opulent and wasteful lifestyles.
The flamboyant Prince George spent vast quantities bringing his lavish interior fantasies to life at the Royal Pavilion.
The great love affair of George's life was with a woman called Maria Fitzherbert.
George pursued Maria obsessively, but she rejected his advances. He threw himself into tantrums and even threatened to kill himself if she would not have him. But she still said no.
What is interesting about Mrs. Fitzherbert is that it appears that she was fighting against her own desire. She was undoubtedly attracted to the prince, would have been flattered by his attention. Finally, he wore her down, and I think one of the key factors was when he actually tried to commit suicide.
Like Carlton House, the pavilion interiors were the very latest in neoclassical elegance and formed the backdrop to the loving couple's alternative court by the seaside. It was in Brighton, not London, that Maria was treated as Princess of Wales, and George felt truly acknowledged. And with all eyes upon him, George was determined to be at the forefront of fashion, giving grand dinner parties and drawing up lists of prominent Whig politicians to be given cabinet jobs the moment he, George, was in charge. He plumped for his first cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, and rejected his erstwhile wife, Maria. But George's love life was never that simple, and while his envoy was on the continent checking out Caroline, George became besotted with a new mistress, 8 years his senior and already a grandmother. Lady Jersey encouraged George's match with Caroline, herself not a renowned beauty, believing that this plain wife would keep George in her bed. In Brunswick, Princess Caroline naively accepted the prince's offer of marriage, sending her court into a frenzy. When Caroline arrived in England, she was largely innocent of the complicated love life of her betrothed. She was met at Greenwich by the formidable figure of Lady Jersey and escorted by her to St James's Palace. Though the two had seen each other's portraits, it was here George and Caroline met for the first time.
All he wanted to do was see Lady Jersey. The one person he was never in love with was Caroline.
On his wedding day, George was in a fragile state. He was, after all, about to commit bigamy, and his thoughts turned to his first wife. The final indignity for Caroline was having Lady Jersey made mistress of the bedchamber. a position she used to taunt and manipulate the Princess of Wales. The will was left unread as the prince recovered, but he could not shake his memories of Maria. George, meanwhile, soon tired of Lady Jersey's sex appeal and tried again to woo Mrs. Fitzherbert. The wretched experiences of the last 5 years have made my life only desirable in one shape to me, and that is in you. Alike yours in life and death, you shall fix my doom. By 1800, George and Maria were once again a happy couple. Their secret marriage had been declared valid by the Pope, something which made no difference whatsoever to the legal position in Protestant Britain, but was nonetheless a cause for them to celebrate. As Prince, Regent and King, George strove to fashion an idealised image of himself. The first thing George did on becoming regent was to appoint himself Field Marshal, so desperate was his desire to eclipse Napoleon and emulate the Allied sovereigns who were leading their national armies into battle. Though George was mocked as the grand entertainment, he had now what he wanted: power and position. However, he shied away from actually joining his troops on the battlefield.
Than the cherry, oh sweeter than the berry, oh ruddier than the cherry, oh sweeter than the berry, oh nip more bright than moonshine light, like kidlings blithe and merry.
What Lawrence achieved with his brush couldn't be equalled with any amount of corsetry. Hidden away in Windsor Great Park, the laudanum-doped king was incapable of focusing on the political affairs of his kingdom and the growing clamour for reform. As the king's influence ebbed away, so did his strength. "I'll be dead by Saturday" became the refrain of his last few years. But when death came, it surprised him. One night he called out, "Good God, what is this?" As his page ran to his side, the king clasped his hand. "My boy," he said, "this is death."
Brighton is an anything-goes sort of town, where people come to party, and in the middle of all this is one of Britain's finest and most outrageous stately homes. It was built 200 years ago as the seaside residence of the playboy Prince Regent, son of the mad King George III. The Prince Regent was young, rich and decadent, but he was bored and restless under the watchful eye of his father in London. Once in Brighton, the Prince wanted a house to reflect his personality, so he asked his friend John Nash to design him something exciting and new. Nash was the architect of the day, and he created an Indian-inspired summer house where the Prince Regent could live his playboy fantasy to the full. On the inside, the pavilion was decorated like no other English palace before it. The Prince Regent loved it. In fact, when he first saw the magnificent music room, he was overcome. And once it became known the Prince had made Brighton his home, the place became even more fashionable. And at the centre of it all, the Prince was entertaining the cream of Brighton's new residents in his palace built for pleasure.
Often people would be surprised to find the Prince sitting here in the middle of everyone else. They'd expect to find him at the head of the table. But when he was in Brighton, he was a lot more casual. He liked to relax, let his hair down and have a good time.
The Prince often got very drunk and could behave outrageously at these banquets. At one of them, he encouraged ladies to take pot shots at ornaments in the room.
Who else would ever go? Is there anyone else?
By the time he became King George IV, the years of constant partying had taken their toll. He'd become grossly overweight and a sad caricature. The pavilion may not be to everyone's taste, but whatever you think, it's a brilliant statement of Regency excess and the perfect centrepiece for a party town.
Neither leeching nor bleeding nor any other treatment offered any sort of relief, and George drifted deeper into madness. Eventually, and with great reluctance, the royal doctors agreed to step down in favor of a so-called expert, Dr. Francis Willis.
Now the time has come for me to relieve all those problems that you have suffered.
It is easy to see Willis as a caricature of medical cruelty, but the regime he imposed on George may well have saved the king from an early death. By the 18th century, there was a growing interest in mental disorders, but the treatment of the insane was hardly pleasant. Willis's methods ranged from the use of ropes and restraints to his own secret weapon, the eye.
Now, this was probably part chicanery.
Made well by me, sir, by me.
That is to say, he would give his patients a particular look, and they knew that behind that look might be some limitations on what they could do.
Doctors from all over the country denounced Willis's methods, but in 1789 the king recovered, and Willis was rewarded with a fat pension.